Mi nombre es Kiki Mazzucchelli, soy la curadora de la sección ZsONAMACO Sur, que este año tiene un tema que se llama la lógica de los materiales. Y yo voy a hablar primero y después tenemos aquí Jennifer Teets, que es una investigadora, artista, curadora, que trabaja con muchos proyectos, pero está desarrollando hace cuántos años, unos 3, 4 años, un proyecto que se llama Elusive Earth, que se trata de una investigación que es muy basada en el uso de materiales, en ese caso de la clay, arcilla. Entonces yo voy a hablar rápidamente de algunos de los trabajos que están en la sección, pero como no hablo español muy bien, voy a hablar en inglés, entonces perdónenme. So the idea for the for this section this year came from a kind of observation of a younger generation of artists who I think are becoming increasingly interested in the use of materials as a primary concern in their works. I think art fairs in general, they are a good environment to take the temperature of the art world. So the idea to kind of organize this section around this observation of this younger generation of artists who are working with different materials. It's kind of an exercise. I mean, I don't have any kind of theory about the subject yet. So it's a first attempt to kind of bring together a variety of artworks that have materials as a primary concern. And as you may have seen, I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to have a look around the section. It's just here really, to the left. It's the one with the purple signs on the gallery names. So in my section, I actually have artists from different generations. So it's not really, it doesn't completely reflect this idea. So it's kind of like a reaction to this observation, but it's not really only young artists. I come from a generation who started their professional careers in the 90s and beginning of the year 2000. And I think for our generation, conceptual practices were much foregrounded in detriment of material practices, which I think were seen by many of our generation and older generations as something a bit like formalist, or, you know, the practices from our generation were much more like conceptually based, based on narrative. There was less regard for the use of materials, and I think this is changing now. So I'm going to go through some of the examples in my section, which, as I said, cover different generations, but also I think highlight certain kinds of materials that were until very recently considered kind of minor. So what I'm talking about is mainly like textiles and ceramics, and I think this is also due to a certain re-evaluation of art history that's been going on in the last few years. So practices that were formerly seen as kind of maybe too feminine or too connected to craft or connected to, let's say, indigenous populations, practices that were seen, that use materials that were seen as characteristic of kind of minor communities, like women, indigenous, etc., are being reevaluated at the moment by the kind of, you know, also the market, but also I think there's lots of academic research in terms of recuperating practices that were overseen in art history. So I think I'll start with this work, which by Ana Gallardo. Sorry, I have to scroll each image. So Ana is one example of an artist from an older generation. She's a key figure in the Argentine art world. I mean, someone who's been working for many, many years. And she's a self-taught artist from Rosario. Now she lives in between Rosario and Buenos Aires. And for ZsONAMACO Sur, she worked on a new commission. So I am not sure if you had the chance of seeing this work installed. I have another picture that I'm going to show next. But this is a triptych. It's one work. And here, Anna, she uses sentences from testimonies, like real testimonies. They're like very short sentences, but like of real situations. They are kind of, very strong facts, So here, there's like 3 walls in the booth. So each work is installed in one wall, and it's all made with charcoal. So you have the sentences at the bottom, which are kind of blurred, but you have this big area of blackness. And you can really see, it's very hard to see here in a reproduction, but if you go there to the booth, you can really see kind of the traces made by Erna in charcoal, like to create this blackness. So the material is very important, I think, in this work, in terms of assigning meaning to the work. So these sentences, they talk about it is a woman talking about, it talks about this woman who was raped while she was giving birth. So, like really strong stuff. And she creates this great area of blackness around it. But also, when you look at the traces that of the gesture of the painting, they're really kind of, there's kind of an aggressiveness that kind of translates this feeling of, despair, really, through the use of materials. Here there's another picture which I thought could be a bit more, where the trace could be a bit more visible, but I mean the work is just next door. You can pop around and see it later. Here I reproduced a phrase, a sentence by Anna. So if you want to read it, considero mi práctica como una herramienta que da evidencia a lo urgente y es irreductible a todo aquello que oscilan entre la invisibilidad y la densidad psicológica, la palabra desesperada y la impotencia, la discreción y la exhibición del tabú, el ímpetu y la resignación, una materialidad mínima y situaciones humanas extremas. So this is what I think, this relationship between the material, because you look at this from a distance and they're almost like this very elegant, minimal, monochromatic paintings, but as you come closer and the text is reviewed and the gestures is reviewed, is a minimal materiality but kind of a very potent one. Another example of a work in the section is Babi Badalov. He's an artist from Azerbaijan. He's been living in Paris for a while and he's a refugee. So Babi, he speaks many languages because of his condition as a refugee. So he speaks the local language from Azerbaijan, I forgot the name, but Russian, French, English, and he doesn't speak any of them very well because his own language had the alphabet changed 3 times during his lifetime. So Babi works on these pieces of cloth, like second-hand cloth that he finds in different shops in Paris. So there is this element of textiles that I was talking about a bit earlier, and about this reevaluation of textiles. But also, I think above all, his matter, like his material, is language. And the way he uses language is not in a narrative way, but in a very poetic way. So you can see some examples here. For instance, like this black flag, humanism. So it's almost like, to me, I mean, I'm Brazilian, there's a big tradition of concrete poetry, visual poetry. So it kind of relates a lot to that, as a language as a visual matter and not really narrative. What he does as well, which I'm going to stand up here to show you, in many of the flags, he creates this little roots on the letters. You can't see it very, here is very visible, you know, like he creates these little roots. And I think it talks a lot about his condition as an uprooted individual, you know, like someone who had to flee his own country and then traveled a lot until he found, until he managed to secure his residency in Paris, which took a while. This is another image of Babi's work. This one was an exhibition at MUCA in Antwerp. It's just like a different image of a different configuration of how the work is installed. And it's usually installed in a very loose way. And here at the fair, for instance, I don't know if this picture shows it, but there's a plinth and people can actually touch, you know, like in a market, you know, like you can pull the cloth, you can have a look what's underneath. And collectors also, like sometimes they put the work on the floor, or so it's very flexible in that sense. Another artist in the section, this time working with ceramics, which I think it's another medium that is quite in vogue in the last few years, is Lucia Pisani. Lucia has been living in London for quite a long time, but she's originally from Caracas. So Lucia, I mean, the work that's here in the at the fair, there's a new body of works, but she usually works. Her starting point is to look at history and to find these female figures in history that she does research about. So from the Victorian era or like from the early 20th century. So specific female figures that she uses as an inspiration to create bodies of work. But her work is never really references directly. There's no text explaining the connection to these particular histories. Everything is done through her use of different materials. She works mainly with photography and ceramics. Ceramics is something that she's been exploring for the past 5-6 years. And this new body of work, it's called Limbica. So it's very much related to the body, and it's a kind of later development of a body of works that she produced last year, where she started to explore the image of the snake in different cultures as a kind of mythical image. And in Venezuela, apparently, there's a term for a woman who's a snake, like a pejorative term, like I don't remember the exact term, but it's something like cuida or something like that. And then this was the first time that Lucia started to work with ceramics by applying cloth, different types of textiles on the surface of the ceramic to achieve this effect that at first was connected to the snake skin. And in this time she's kind of using the same technique to give it like a more bodily feeling, you know, like to create almost like a skin. And the pieces are very much suggestive of like kind of body parts, but like non-identifiable body parts. And there's also this connection that Lucia talks about, that the term limbica comes from a part of the brain called el cerebro límbico, which is el cerebro reptiliano, again the connection to the snakes, which is the part of the brain that controls emotions and basic impulses, like sexual impulse. So in this body of work that she's presenting here, the connection is again to the body, but it's limbica instead of limbico, because her connection is always with like female identity. This is a different body of works that Lucia produced, and they are, it's a technique that you do photography on glass. I forgot the name of the technique, but it's a very old-fashioned 19th century technique that the negative is on glass, and these are unique prints. And this is a kind of earlier work when she was doing some research on moths and butterflies and the process of transformation in relation to female identity. So she produced a series of works where she uses this African cloth to create a kind of ¿cómo se llama la mariposa cuando está? But when it's turning from larva to butterfly. You know, when the larvas are becoming butterflies. Yeah, but there's a name for that stage, a very technical name. It's another name, but yeah. Another artist now with a very different approach to materials, also in the section, is Luis Carrera Mal from Mexico City. So Luis has a very particular way of working with materials. He works with found materials and he reorganizes them in space. So, well, it's in my computer. Okay, so there's a problem here with the... No. It is. It's on the screen, but it's not there.
What do you need?
Because the image here is actually oh, now it is. Okay, so this is the piece by Luis that's in the section. And I think Luis, he works in a very similar way to a Brazilian artist called Fernanda Gomes. Fernanda is also an artist that finds this kind of usually wood and this type of materials and reorganizes them in space. And I mean, they have very different styles of reconfiguring materials. In the case of Luis, this is also a new commission for the fair, and it's a very effective project for him, because the materials he used in this booth belong to a business that his family used to have, an agro-business in the 80s and 90s. That was very, very successful. But obviously with the changes, especially in the 90s, with the introduction of importation to Mexico, his family business just, suffered with the economic crisis and everything, and it slowly disappeared. But recently he found out that all those materials that belonged to the farm were stored in a trailer in his family property. And he took out all this material, and that's what he used in this installation. So then you can see, like on the wall, those pieces of cardboard with the round marks. This is where they used to store bottles and cans. So it's the mark of the bottles and cans. This piece of burnt wood, was a beautiful olive grove that existed in this farm. And then I think in a similar way as we do in Brazil, when piece of land is not used for a long time, you just burn it. So he found this burned olive groves that he remembered from his childhood. So all these materials were part of this factory, this farm, that he reconfigured in space for ZsONAMACO. And I think, like just going back to the idea of materials. Here, I think materials really carry like this memory. You know, like for him, materials are not ¿cómo se dice? Isento. Sí, que tiene que vienen carregados de significado, que no son cosas sin significado. And so, yeah. So I think in his practice, there's always like, I think he's always concerned with the meaning that is expressed by the materials he uses, and what kind of meanings he can create by making these different compositions. I think I'm going to do just this one because we're running late. This is a piece by another Mexican artist, also a new commission for ZsONAMACO Sur, Minerva Cuevas, which you probably know already. So Minerva, in this project, it's a kind of continuation of a project that she did at the Ludwig Museum, which was around the figure of Bertolt Brecht. And here, at the front of the booth, this is the front wall of the booth, she has reproduced this sentence by Brecht, what happens to the whole when the cheese is gone. And the surface of the booth was painted with a mixture of carrots and resin, so it's like kind of like a paint that she made with carrots and resin. And her idea is to have this to promote like this dialogue with Brecht, but this time in the Mexican context, because obviously Brecht was very much interested in a theater that was very realist, that dealt with political issues, and she's trying to bring this memory not in a super direct way, but through these references. And very important, why the carrot? So Brecht has this publication, which is very political, like a collection of photographs. And there's one photograph out of the whole book that stands out, which is the photograph of a sexy carrot, as he puts it. So she departs from this kind of absurd idea of like a sexy carrot to promote this dialogue with the Mexican political context. Because this phrase, what happens to the whole when the cheese is gone, to Brecht, it was related to this, to the idea of war and peace. So what happens to peace when war is gone? What happens to war when peace is gone? So it's this idea that, one is always feeding the other. And here she uses an image, which she tells me that was a very important labor union in Mexico of the electricians, who were always present in demonstrations, in all kinds of demonstrations. And this particular union apparently was shut down a couple of years ago or 3 years ago. So she mixes this which is like the logo of this union with a sentence by Brecht. I mean, I really advise you to go and see, because it's very important that you read the sentences. They don't relate exactly, I mean, there's no kind of explanation or narrative, but it's more like, I think, a collage of these sentences and these images. And here at the booth, we have these actors who are in, at sometimes during the fair, they're there like peeling the carrots. So it's also a way of talking about value, you know, like, because if you have like a normal carrot, it has a value. But if a carrot has been peeled by someone who's been paid to peel the carrot, the value is transformed. I don't. Do you think I have time to just speak quickly about this? Or I'll just speak quickly about Eddie Aparicio, because he also he did a residency in Mexico City for 4 weeks before the fair. So Eddie was born in LA, but from his father was from El Salvador. So he's a very young artist, and he started working with rubber that he applies on tree trunks. So what you see here is this layer of rubber that he applied on a tree trunk, and he pulls it out and he mounts it on a board, or to create this kind of painting. But it's really about it's a kind of archaeology of different contexts. He's interested in the marks that people leave on these trees, because when you pull the rubber, you get all the like the inscriptions, but also like graffiti. In this case, the color is the color that comes out of the tree when he pulls the layer of rubber. So it's almost like an archaeology of different contexts from, I think this is kind of one of the most primal instincts of human beings, which is to make an inscription. So in some cases, this is the Mexican pieces. They're like the 3 pieces at the back of the booth were done in Mexico. And I think you can really see, because this one was done in LA. If you go there and you see this, the type of inscriptions, they're quite particular. Like the ones done in Mexico, they're much smaller and much more intricate. And the ones done in LA are different, and there's lots of graffiti, and so I think so Eddie is very interested in kind of what can he find out about this different context from this very kind of like primal marks made by passersby. So I think I'm going to wrap up here so we have enough time for Jennifer's presentation, and thank you very much.